Our next speaker is Adrian Notz, who is a curator at the ETH AI Center. From 2012 to 19, he was an artistic director of the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. From 2010 to 2015, he was the head of the Department of Fine Arts at the School of Design at Saint-Gallen. Notz has organized and curated numerous exhibitions, events, conferences, actions, and interventions with international artists, activists, and thinkers in the Cabaret Voltaire, as well as around the globe. So, Adrian, good to meet you. Please.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me for the conference here. I'll share my screen. So I'm trying to talk about autistic quantum randomness in relation to the topic of the conference. And I will start with the AAI manifesto by Albrecht, in which postscript Albrecht Dürer is mentioned. In the postscript of the AAI manifesto, Albrecht Dürer's woodcut rhinoceros from the year 1515 is mentioned as a remarkable example of artistic imagination. Because Dürer never saw the rhinoceros, but based his illustration only on sketches and descriptions by others. And since I read this manifesto, it was very inspiring to me. I have been using this reference a lot lately in talks in the relation of art and science and AI and art. Not only is it a great illustration of artistic imagination, it is also a great example of how art and science 500 years ago were still understood as one. Dürer and his contemporaries Da Vinci and Michelangelo, today commonly known as artists, weren't understood as artists back then. They were craftsmen, engineers, so to say, scientists, and maybe even today we might say innovators and inventors. And as such, they are also on the facade of the ETH main building, which you can see here. Last week, I could see an edition of the original woodcut print in the graphic collection of the ETH Zurich. And I was told that the rhinoceros was actually gifted by Alfonso de Albuquerque, the second governor of India in Goa, to King Manuel I of Portugal. Alfonso got the rhinoceros from Sultan Muzaffar II, emperor of today's Gujarat, as a diplomatic present a year before it sailed around the African continent to Lisbon. Because King Manuel I wanted to impress Pope Leo X even more, a year before he had gifted the Pope an Indian elephant, he sent the rhinoceros beautifully decorated end of the year 1515 on a boat towards Rome. It stopped in Marseille because the French King François I also wanted to have a look at it. This was the last time it was seen alive. The boat got into a heavy storm and sank. Because the rhinoceros was chained to the boat, it drowned. The dead body was found at the French coast, and the skin of the animal was sent back to Lisbon, stuffed with straw, and sent to Pope Leo X again, already in February 1516. In the AII manifesto, Dürer is compared to AI mainly in regards of accuracy and its convincing power. We could also understand Dürer's rhinoceros woodcut as a kind of neural network DALL-E image, because he created an image just on the basis of text input. Since last October 2021, I am working as a curator at the ETH AI Center in Zurich, together with artist Nora Al-Badri, whose work you can see here, Babylonian Vision, GAN-generated images for a techno-heritage of Mesopotamia. And our mission, to say it very simple, is to bring art into the context of scientific and technological research and development of AI foundations and applications. Therefore, our AI and art initiative helps strengthen the focus on an interdisciplinary co-evolving AI. This focus on an interdisciplinary co-evolving AI is connected to the mission of the ETH AI Center, which is to lead the way towards a trustworthy, accessible, and inclusive artificial intelligence for the benefit of society. Accessible and inclusive AI means that AI technologies and applications are not only understandable and interpretable, but also easy to use and with no or at least low costs involved. In this sense, as I can see from our fellows and faculties, there is a high interest in sharing these new technologies and making them as accessible as possible for everyone. It is not so much about competition, but much more about collaboration. Trustworthy AI research is following 4 ethical principles that were set up only 3 years ago by an expert group on artificial intelligence from the EU Commission in their ethics guideline for trustworthy AI. They are respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness and explicability. These principles then also lead to 7 requirements in the realization of trustworthy AI, which are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity and non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being and accountability. Or in short, as one paper on the topic mentions, we want to have a decent AI. So researchers and engineers are currently working under high pressure on the question how abstract and almost philosophical notions like individual rights, fairness, robustness, trust, causality, bias, norms, interpretability, and explainability can become part of AI programming. The ETH AI Center therefore wants to create an environment for the pursuit of trustworthy AI systems and serendipitous collaborations across AI foundations, applications, implications, and impact areas. Currently, there are 120 faculties connected to the ETH AI Center with over 200 postdoc researchers and more than 1,400 PhD students. Alone, this big interest from all the 16 departments of the ETH Zurich shows how pressing the topic is, from research to engineering to startups and industry. At the moment, there are also 25 PhD and postdoc fellows at the AI Center advancing interdisciplinary AI research, mostly with 2 mentors from different fields with equal weight in supervision, as well as collaborations from different disciplines and departments. In my past life, I was a director of the Cabaret Voltaire, birthplace of Dada, so I can try and refer a lot of what I'm learning right now to what the Dadaists were doing. And I like to use Hans Arp as an example. For Hans Arp, randomness was a key of his work, right from the creation of the first Dadaist group in Zurich during the First World War. Unlike Tristan Tzara, the Dada poet and ideologue, Arp did not see randomness simply as a phenomenon, but as a law underlying all creation. Arp said, "I continued to develop the technique of paper collage by banishing the will in the composition and relying on automatic execution. I called this working according to the laws of chance, the law that contains all others and that escapes us, as well as the primary cause that brings forth all life and that can only be experienced by a total abandonment to the unconscious. I said that he who followed this law created life in its purest form." At the time of Dada and after, Arp opted for the erasure of the artist's subject, letting his creations escape his own control. To do this, he sometimes relied on a form of automatism, sometimes on the laws of chance. Accepting the laws of chance, his idea was to work in the same way that nature generates its forms, searching for the elemental, the spontaneous, so that his work in itself would constitute a reality and not an imitation. Nature works with a limited number of similar elements, the stars in the sky, but also the flowers in the fields, the trees in the forest, which it groups and bundles into various constellations. According to Arp, these apparently randomly placed elements are in fact linked together by laws that are imperceptible to man. This explains the paradoxical expression laws of chance, laws that govern the distribution of quadrangular pieces of paper on some of Arp's early collages. The time when Arp discovered the laws of randomness was also the time of the First World War, with battlefields in Europe, where for the first time in history, tanks, submarines, airplanes, rockets, gas bombs, and other mass-killing machines were killing millions of humans. In this context, the Dadaists in Europe were very skeptical, to say it mildly, about technological progress. Like the founder of Cabaret Voltaire, the birthplace of Dada, Hugo Ball, said already before the Dada times in 1915. The war is based on a glaring error. People have been confused with the machines. One should decimate the machines instead of the people. Later, when the machines march by themselves and alone, it will be more in order. Then, with good reason, the whole world will cheer when they smash each other to pieces. So maybe to a certain degree, we could say today, Ball was talking about autonomous systems. On the other side of the Atlantic, European artists like Marcel Duchamp, Francis Picabia, Man Ray, and others were very enthusiastic about the same technological progress. Picabia, for example, praised the city for inspiring a complete revolution in his methods of work. He said, "The visit to America has brought about a complete revolution in my methods of work. Almost immediately upon coming to America, it flashed me that the genius of the modern world is in machinery, and that through machinery, art ought to find a most vivid expression. The machine has become more than a mere adjunct of life. It is really a part of human life, perhaps the very soul. I have enlisted the machinery of the modern world and introduced it into my studio." He then started a new series of mechanomorph drawings that were influenced by the industrial landscapes of New York and were indeed a revolution in art. The mechanomorph drawings were portraits of machines, often with anthropomorphic, psychological, and even erotic undertones. Almost a bit like our imagination of machine hallucinations today, just less bodiless. Also in Europe, after World War I, artists started embracing the idea of the machine. Maybe like today, there were a lot of hopes on the technological progress that would, in a leap forward, potentially solve a lot of human civilization problems. In Berlin, they got rid of art and started celebrating the machine art of Tatlin, referring to the Russian constructivists. This marked a change in art towards functionalism, which was to shape people's artistic horizons in the future. The beginnings of socialism and the collective economy brought not only accelerated economic power, but also technical innovations that completed industrialization in Russia and gave people a new view of the world. New forms of economy and work emerged, and in art, that is with Russian constructivists, suprematists, and futurists, this development was greeted with euphoria and a new kind of representation. The artist was no longer, or again maybe, seen only as an artist, but also as an engineer who would shape the future of humankind. Key speaker Refik Anadol and also other artists talk about machine hallucinations or quantum dreaming or in the context of this conference, also potentially about quantum imagination. If you use the term dream as relating to humans, it seems that a dream is a way of processing the input from our conscious and awake day experience, not just visually, but with all our senses. Hallucinations, on the contrary, are perceptions in the absence of an external stimulus, but that still have the qualities of a real perception. It is a mental wandering, contrary to dreaming happening in a wakeful moment. Both dreaming and hallucination produce forms of perception, while hallucinations are almost something like augmented realities occurring in any sensory modality: visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, proprioceptive, equilibrioceptive, nociceptive, thermoceptive, and chronoceptive. Hallucinations are multimodal when multiple sensory modalities occur at the same time. Both terms, contrary to imagination, are researched also in psychological as well as neuroscientific contexts. As today's machine learning is based on deep artificial neural networks, there might be a very direct analogy of how human and machine hallucination and dreaming is generated. Refik uses specialized GAN technologies like deep convolutional GAN, probabilistic GAN, or style GAN. Simply said, this means that out of existing data sets, totally new data is created. The pivot into the new lies in the training of the algorithm. It is not a remix or a style. It is learning to generate on its own. Like hallucinations, it might be more advanced than dreaming, because dreams might just be perceptions from memories popping up, like an image style transferred out of an image database. Last week, in a lab visit at the ETH Computer Vision Lab, there was a nice moment when researcher Martin Danelian corrected himself in an introduction to their work on in-painting using denoising diffusion probabilistic models. He was explaining how a GAN generated faces and corrected himself by saying, "This is not a face, but an image that looks like a face." Interestingly, other images of faces, referring to portraits of existing human beings, are still understood to be faces. This is unlike surrealist René Magritte's statement, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," referring to a painting of a pipe that not being the pipe itself. The slight shift of dimension might explain also nicely the shift between human hallucinations and machine hallucinations. At a talk in one of Bangalore's big IT companies, I was asked about my idea of randomness. Having only art, Dada, and the avant-garde and art history as a reference system, I explained how artists started working a century ago in Europe according to the laws of randomness. That was about in the time known today as the old quantum theory. The young engineer asking was specialized in quantum randomness and wanted to see how my concepts of artistic randomness could be adapted to his research. Quantum randomness is the statistical manifestation of quantum indeterminacy, witnessable in results of experiments repeated many times. The relationship between quantum indeterminacy and randomness is subtle and be considered differently. In classical physics, experiments of chance, such as a coin tossing or a dice throwing, are deterministic in the sense that perfect knowledge of the initial conditions would render outcomes perfectly predictable. The randomness stems from the ignorance of physical information and the initial toss or throw. In a diametrical contrast, in the case of quantum physics, quantum randomness does not stem from any such physical information. Quantum randomness is exclusively the output of measurement experiments whose input settings introduce logical independence into quantum systems. Logical independence is a phenomenon in mathematical logic. It refers to the null logical connectivity that exists between mathematical propositions that neither prove nor disprove one another. The young engineer then also explained me how quantum computing based on energy is analog, in contrary to the digital binary system of conventional computing. We both didn't really understand what the other was talking about. Like the Irish writer James Joyce said about a century ago, misunderstanding is the normal state. To understand is an exception. Even if the young Indian engineer and I didn't understand each other properly, because we do not speak each other's languages, we still, in the pivot of the term, sparked both our imaginations and triggered each other in an entangled manner. We changed our rotation simultaneously without knowing how. In the ETH Wolfgang Pauli Lectures 2022, I learned from theoretical physicist Professor Juan M. Maldacena from the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, USA, in March 2022, in his lecture, Black Holes and the Structure of Space-Time, that entanglement plays a crucial role in determining the structures of space-time. This means that two entangled faraway parts of the universe, the two entangled entities in faraway parts of the universe have the potential of creating a wormhole and therefore change the structure of space-time. One of our AI and art projects in collaboration with the ETH Library is together with the David Graeber Institute, an anthropologist, activist, and anarchist who unfortunately died last year. He is currently most known for the recently published book, The Dawn of Everything, or also for 5,000 Years of Death or Bullshit Jobs. Together with his widow, the artist Nika Dubrovsky, we are working on transforming his archive into an open data research project. And in a small book called Anarchism in a Matter of Speaking, Graeber talks about the importance of conversation. A lot of anarchist practice, at least the kind I think of quintessential anarchists, revolves around a certain principle of dialogue. There is a lot of attention paid to learning how to make pragmatic, cooperative decisions with people who have fundamentally different understandings of the world, without actually trying to convert them to your particular point of view. It always struck me as interesting that in the ancient world, whether in India, China, or Greece, philosophy was written almost exclusively in the form of a dialogue, even if it's often this kind of dialogue where one guy does 95% of the talking. Thought, self-reflective consciousness, that which we tend to see as making us truly human, was assumed to be a collective, political, or dyadic, but something that almost by definition couldn't be done all by yourself. Or rather, solitary reflection was usually the ultimate goal. The aim of philosophy was, often at least, to cultivate yourself to the point where individual self-consciousness might be possible. And different philosophical schools, from Buddhism to Stoicism, tended to employ different forms of meditation, diet, spiritual exercises, as means of ultimately attaining the status of a sage, who really could be self-conscious, who really could be a self-conscious individual. But it was only by starting with dialogue that one had any chance of getting there. For me, that is for Graeber, that's the most important break Descartes introduces. Christian thought had already been moving away from dialogue, but Descartes completely turned things around by starting with the self-conscious individual, and only then asking how that individual can have any kind of communicative relation with anyone else. It's the basis of all subsequent European philosophy, but it's also absurd, as neuroscience has shown the ancients were right. Real thought is almost entirely dialogic. Not that cognitive scientists usually say it explicitly, because for some reason they too have a strange mental block on conversation. But they do make clear that that's what is called the window of consciousness, that time during which most of us actually are full self-aware, self-reflecting beings, is rare and brief. It averages around maybe 7 seconds. Otherwise, you are generally operating on autopilot, unless, of course, you are talking to someone. You can have conversations on autopilot too, of course, but if you are really interested and engaged with someone else, you can maintain it for hours. The implications of this are profound, even though we rarely seem to acknowledge it. Most self-aware thought takes place at exactly the moment when the boundaries of the self are least clear. This was my short presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the dialogue, self-pilot dialogue and monologue at the same time.